Hi, everyone. I'm Aicha Elbasri, researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and I'm delighted to moderate this distinguished panel hosting three top Iran experts to discuss the domestic and regional ramifications in Iranian politics after the tragic death of President Raisi. We are very pleased to host Mehran Kamrava, Professor of Government at Georgetown University, Qatar, and Director of the Iranian Studies Unit here at the Arab Center. Dr. Dina Esfandiary, a Senior Advisor in the Middle East and North Africa Department of the International Crisis Group. And last but not least, Dr. Hamidreza Azizi, Non-Resident Fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, Visiting Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and an Associate Researcher at Clingendale, the Netherlands Institute of International Relations. Let's open the discussion with Dr. Kamrava. Can you briefly describe today's Iranian politics and what is happening since the passing of President Raisi?
Thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure being here, and my thanks to both you, Dr. Aicha, and my co-panelists. Iran is in a period of transition, but Iranian political leaders want to portray everything in terms of politics as usual. What we've seen is a very steady effort to make sure that the crisis of having lost the president and the foreign minister, two very visible figures, is minimized in terms of domestic politics. What we've seen over the last week or so is a clamping down on any expression of dissent. The government has been even more authoritarian, if you will, than it is actually known, so they're gearing up for presidential elections. The candidates are lining up, insiders, of course, political insiders, and I would say that among the population there is a sense of resignation by and large, but also apprehension of not knowing what will happen next. And so I think, Iran is one of those cases when you think there can't be any more crises, or it can't, the circumstances can't get any worse, something happens. And we're constantly surprised, or I might say disappointed by the unfolding of developments. That's where we are today, kind of in terms of a very broad picture of what is happening. There's a lot more, but I'm sure it'll come out during the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Azizi, in the context of this, what Dr. Kamrava described as a transition, a mix of transition, apprehension, and clamp down on the situation, what do we know about Mohammad Mukhbir, the acting president, and regarding the upcoming elections? Both Tehran mayors Ali Reza Zakani and Saeed Jalili Ali, the Khamenei's representative in the Supreme National Security Council, they both have declared their bid for presidency. So do they stand a chance? And who else might be considering a run for the office of presidency?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Many thanks to Arab Center and especially Professor Kamrava for the invitation. Professor Kamrava depicted the overall picture of Iranian politics after the death of Raisi quite well. But with regard to these specific persons that you mentioned, I think it would be actually better to look at the affiliations that each of these people have, and basically instead of focusing on people and who's going to be, for example, the next president, or in the broader context of transition to post-Khamenei, who's going to be supreme leader, it would be actually better to look at the factions and trends. So what we are basically witnessing right now in Iran, in the political space, which is more limited than ever before, limited to the conservatives, is basically a kind of intra-elite factionalism and intra-elite competition. So here, this is important to look a little bit back when Raisi was brought to power, I would say, as president. So many people would expect, even in Iran, there were discussions that there would be an era of unity in power, or the kind of political system being sort of monolithic. But since then, we have witnessed this kind of intra-conservative factionalism. So with regard to Mohammad Mokhber, of course, he has close ties to the so-called deep state, which consists of the core IRGC, I would say, military security leadership of the country. And he is known to be, in charge of, partly in charge of the IRGC's economic empire, of course, which, posits them in a very good situation in terms of impacting the overall trends in the country. So I remember actually when he was named as Raisi's vice president, there were rumors, speculations that it's actually Mokhber who's going to run the show, especially with an eye to the post-Khamenei transition, and not Raisi himself. So regardless of whether or not he's going to be a candidate for presidency, I think in this transitional period, he's going to basically preserve his influence. And then on the other two people, that is part of what I call the ultra hardline end of the conservative spectrum. People who are usually, not all of them, of course, but usually tied to the so-called Stability Front or Jabhe Paydari. And so we have that part of the political conservative camp, and on the other side we have the so-called more pragmatist, elements like Ghalibaf. So it's a matter of, I think, sort of alliance building, coalition building in the run-up to the election between these different factions of conservative camp, and also we have, of course, the traditional conservatives like Ali Larijani. So. In one word, what I want to say is that we need to look a little bit beyond the people and look at the trends. It will remain limited, this competition in the conservative camp, but it may, kind of be a diverse range of pragmatism to ultra hardline end of the spectrum, as I mentioned.
Thank you. Dr. Esfandiary, Dr. Azizi just spoke of factional politics. So within this factional politics, do you anticipate any change in Iran's foreign policy, especially in its regional policy and its relations with two neighbors, Saudi Arabia and the UAE? Do you see any change?
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think much like in domestic politics over the next little while, Iran is going to try in its foreign policy to project continuity. I would argue in its foreign policy, it will be somewhat easier to do that than in domestic politics. And the reason for that is the president and the foreign minister, counterintuitively in Iran, doesn't actually set much of the policy on foreign policy. The decision-making really lies with the supreme leader and arguably with the Revolutionary Guards. The president, the foreign minister, they set the tone, and they are obviously forced to implement the decisions. But really, that decision-making lies with the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards, which means that actually the loss of the president and the foreign minister shouldn't have that much of an impact on Iran's foreign policy. It should stay largely continuous. Iran, for the foreseeable future, will continue to focus on building ties with the Gulf Arab neighbors. It will continue to focus on building ties with countries in the East. None of that is going to change. Perhaps the one interesting aspect will be the impact that their deaths will have on the talks on the nuclear file and the discussions that are going on directly with the US, hosted by Oman, and potentially in other forums in the region. That might be interesting, not so much because of the direct impact of the death of the president and the foreign minister, but because that seems to have led to a tiny bit of a rejigging, a tiny bit of a shakeup in terms of who may be responsible for this file, with some rumors circulating. I don't know if they've been confirmed or not, or yesterday at least there were rumors circulating that somebody like Shamkhani, who's very well known in the region, was now going to be controlling the nuclear file. I'll leave it to my other two co-panelists to confirm whether this has now been confirmed or not.
Okay, thank you so much. It's quite important to highlight what you just said, that we should expect continuity rather than any major change. So let me go back to Dr. Kamrava. Firstly, congratulations on the recent publication of your book on the political resilience of the Islamic Republic. Now, regarding the loss of the top leadership, what implications does this hold? And more broadly, what does this say about the resilience of the state? Do you still see that resilience?
Yeah, thank you very much for the congratulatory note. I appreciate it. This is a state, this is a system that was born in crisis, and it actually excels in crisis management. It tends to be lousy at management in ordinary times, as we've seen in terms of management of the economy, kind of trying to appease the public. It does everything possible to shoot itself in the foot, to alienate the general public, but it's a system that seems to excel in crisis management. And we've seen it over the last week or so after the death of the president, the sitting president, and the foreign minister. It's almost as if the system kicked into high gear and has kind of moved beyond. It's almost as if Raisi's death is old news, and now we're looking at kind of presidential elections and, as Dr. Azizi mentioned, factional alignments and all that. So, we have seen a political system that's remarkably resilient. The core decision-making, as Dr. Esfandiary just mentioned, which is the Supreme National Security Council in charge of foreign and security policies, kind of the body of the system, what inside Iran is called the nizam or nidam in Arabic, that has stayed consistent and resilient. And I don't anticipate major changes or kind of a shaking to the system. This is not, incidentally, important to remember. It's important to remember that this is not the first time a sitting president in the Islamic Republic dies in office. Early on in 1981, the very young, nascent Islamic Republic lost its president. And at that time, there was also a prime minister. It lost its prime minister, and a number of other influential political insiders were killed in a terrorist bombing in Iran. And the system survived back then. And although conditions have significantly changed since, and kind of the level of nationalist attachment to the state as a protector has significantly eroded since, but the resilience of the state and the continuity of the body politic continues unabated.
Thank you. Let me take this question to Dr. Azizi. The acting president, Mohammad Mokhber, addressed the country's new parliament yesterday, and Iran's parliament re-elected the hardliner Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf as a speaker. What do you make of this, and what are the anticipated priorities of the new government, if you can think of any?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Parliament actually before this happens was a very interesting case of what I described as basically intra-conservative rivalry and factionalism, because in the run-up to the parliamentary elections, which took place in March, we saw a lot of actually reciprocal attacks by these different people, those who belong to the traditional part of the conservative camp and the hardliners of the Stability Front, etc. And then it also extended to the post-election actually phase with those same people, the ultra hardliners of the Stability Front, trying to oust Ghalibaf and the rival camp. So in the kind of overall setting of the parliament, it wasn't really unexpected that Ghalibaf would be elected once again as the Speaker of the Parliament, given that all the I would say all people with even a marginal attachment to moderate and reformist camps were already disqualified. But what is different now after the death of Raisi is the potential opportunity that the person of Ghalibaf may see in basically running for presidency, something that he tried a few times and failed. But this time, given that actually the political system is facing a dilemma in who to find to replace Raisi, who would be as reliable and as basically functional in their own standard, of course, so that there would be a smooth transition, a smooth succession process. So I've said this before. I say this again very briefly. Raisi had three main characteristics which made him a favorable candidate actually for being at the president position the day that Khamenei dies. So he was a weak president, which would mean that he would be easily manipulated by the so-called deep state, by the core IRGC and security leadership. He was a true loyalist, and also he was a cleric. So these characteristics together means that, at least in ideal scenario, he was expected to bridge different factions within the conservative camp, which is the kind of IRGC itself, and then the ultra hardliners, and then the traditional clerics, who traditional conservatives who also are attached to the basically clerical establishment. So finding someone with the same characteristic seems very difficult. And here comes what I mentioned as potential alliances. So one of the rumors that we can hear these days is that Ghalibaf, for example, may have already, he might have already started negotiations, back-channel negotiations with Mokhber to be named as the candidate of the deep state. His loyalty is, of course, in question, I would say, because now we name him as ultra hardliner. He used to call himself actually a moderate. So he's been swinging between not only different factions of the conservative camp, but in the whole spectrum of politics in Iran. So that would mean that he's maybe easy to reach a deal with, but still, it's comes down to the question of whether a better candidate can be found. And one final point, I think, which would be relevant is, a factor which is very important to consider is that whether the leadership of the Islamic Republic is going to change track, or whether they are going to continue on the same path. And I'm not only speaking about the political sphere, not only about, for example, social freedom, etc. Most importantly, and again, this is something that is quite related to a smooth transition to post-Khamenei, is economic situation, because economy is the main concern among the leadership as a factor that can bring about instability down the road. So in that sense, Raisi proved to be quite, dysfunctional in managing the economy. So somebody like Ghalibaf actually might be better positioned, especially if you consider potential coalition with Mokhber, which means the economic establishment of the IRGC. If that happens, I mean, in the run-up to the election, if we see substantial support from the deep state to Ghalibaf, then we may consider that the political system is considering change of track with a more pragmatist guy, I mean, economically speaking, of course, while at the political level and social level, we are not going to see any change, I think.
Well, thank you. The discussion, I think the whole discussion will be about transition, continuity, and lots of question marks on some issues. I would like to take this question to Dr. Esfandiary. You already mentioned that we shouldn't expect any disruption, any major change, and in terms of foreign policy and even regional policy. Does this also apply to the relationship between Iran and Qatar, which has been very close, actually closer than as they are ever now? And is it likely to continue also?
In short, yes. I don't think there's any reason for the Iranian system to move away from its current policy, not just with Qatar, but generally with the Gulf Arab neighbors. I think the system as a whole took a decision when Raisi came to power to basically start to, I was going to say mend some of the ties, but it's not even driven by such a positive way of thinking about it. It was just to de-escalate and to ensure that it didn't have so many problems on its basically, yeah, on its hands and on its borders. It's very similar to some of the Gulf Arab policies of no problems with neighbors. Well, Iran kind of decided to also embark on this line. Initially, prior to this administration, what the Iranians tried to do was really to engage the Gulf Arab states as a group. But over time, it noticed that that wasn't going to be possible because of the different positions of the Gulf Arab states. And as you rightly mentioned, it decided to work with the countries within the GCC that were willing to work with it, and at first leave aside those that were more problematic to come to later. And with Qatar, the relationship has been very even keel, relatively comfortable. There hasn't been too many bumps along the road. The ties, I think, span different parts of government and different levels of government. So there is no reason why any of that would change just because the president and the foreign minister died.
Okay, well, there is some change, at least when it comes to talks, nuclear talks between Iran and the agency. And I want to continue with you, Dr. Esfandiary, on today's news headlines. The International Atomic Energy Agency has announced today that it has suspended talks between Iran and the agency after the death of President Brahim Raisi. So this suspension comes as Rafael Grossi, the agency's chief, reiterated his concern over public statement made in Iran regarding its nuclear weapons capability. So how do you describe the current relations between Iran and the nuclear watchdog?
Just to be clear, Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapons capability as far as we know yet. So its nuclear program generally. But I completely agree that over the course of the last few weeks and arguably months, Iran's rhetoric on its nuclear program has somewhat hardened, much more than it had in the past. And I think this is part of the Islamic Republic's desire to use it as a card for deterrence in light of, some of the growing tensions in the region and beyond, but in the region, namely with Israel, for example. It's really using its status as a nuclear threshold state. So that means a country that's on the cusp of being able to develop a nuclear weapon should it want to, which is the bit we're not sure about right now. I think it's really using that status right now for its deterrence purposes. And this hardened rhetoric, I think, is intended to elevate that status and perhaps, inject a dose of doubt in the international community about where Iran stands right now with its political decision to go nuclear or not. Up until now, despite the progress that's like stopped and started with Iran's nuclear program, the prevailing assessment of Iran's program has been that the decision makers in Iran have not taken the decision to go for a bomb. But this latest round of heightened rhetoric really, really injects doubt in that. Again, they haven't made a decision to do so. The Supreme Leader has been really clear that it's not something that they want anytime soon. But I think that this talk is intended to create a sense of discomfort and really reestablish deterrence for Iran. It's concerning, for sure, which is part of the reason why the US and Iran have been conducting talks in places like Oman. It's to address this. The problem is that we find ourselves in a context where it's unlikely to lead to much. The US is in an election year. They, along with some of the US's European allies, are talking about expanding discussions with Iran, not of restricting them to the nuclear issue like they have in the past, but rather expanding it to include a range of other problematic issues, from the missiles to its regional activities, all of which would make, reaching yet another agreement or deal, or even a deal on a suspension of progress of Iran's nuclear program. So the talk is heightening on one side. On the Iranian side, direct discussions and oversight into Iran's nuclear program, as you mentioned, are suspended. And on the other side, the US and its allies, it's becoming increasingly difficult to even fathom what an agreement on Iran's nuclear program would look like. So it's just not looking good.
Well, thank you for your insights on the complexity. Please go ahead, Dr. Kamrava.
May I just interject?
Sure.
I completely agree with everything that Dr. Esfandiary just said, but I think we also need to keep in mind the logic that is becoming increasingly prevalent in Iran, which is that, look, Iran abided by the terms of the 2015 nuclear agreement, and what did it get? A unilateral American withdrawal. And the European Union didn't have the backbone to stand up to the Americans. So they followed suit. They just do whatever the Americans tell them to do. So the assumption in Iran is that if Iran doesn't increase the rhetoric, as Dina just mentioned, and if Iran doesn't poke the International Atomic Energy Agency every once in a while, and by implication the European Union, with its kind of either increasing enrichment or at least talk of an increasing enrichment, or now, as we just heard, the highest ranking officials kind of saying, you know what, we might have to rethink our assumption. In fact, Abbas Araghchi, the current advisor to the Supreme Leader, former Deputy Foreign Minister, is here in Doha. And yesterday he said, Israeli threats will make us rethink our, what might lead us to rethink our assumptions about nuclear weapons. So I think the logic that's becoming prevalent in Iran is that Iran doesn't really have too many bargaining chips, because the sanctions keep getting ramped up. No matter kind of what Iran does, the United States or the European Union see it as the guilty party, even if it engages in tit for tat with Israel, as we saw in the recent attack. And so as a result, it's on the receiving end. And so the logic then is to kind of either go nuclear or at least start talking about going nuclear as a pressure point, as a form of leverage.
Well, thank you for this extra information on this important file. Let's go back to Dr. Azizi. I want to touch on the major issue of Israel's war in Gaza. To what extent, if any, is Amir Abdullahian's disappearance from the scene likely to impact Iran's policy towards Israel's war in Gaza?
Well, as Dr. Esfandiary mentioned, overall, we are not going to see any substantial change in Iran's foreign policy, and that also extends to the area of regional policy, of course. But I would look at this specific topic, the so-called axis of resistance, how Iran's relationship is going to evolve with that, and the overall impact on Iran's positioning in the war in Gaza. I mean, there's two different aspects to it. One would be the Iranian positioning on the ground, and the other one would be Iran's diplomatic positioning. So on the first aspect, on the ground positioning, there is going to be absolutely no change. And actually, one of the possibilities, as we also mentioned with regard to domestic politics, the Iranian government basically doubling down on closing the space, kind of more securitization in order to project the image of being in control of things. Something similar may happen actually in the region, and it has already happened, I would say, in the sense that Iran and its allies may actually double down, or at least not decrease the level of tension with Israel, in order to show that the internal crisis, or whatever it is going to be called or seen, is not going to impact Iran's overall policy. So two important, quite interrelated developments have happened in the past few days. The first one was the kind of unprecedented meeting, at least at the public level, between the heads of the IRGC, like General Salami, the chief commander of the IRGC, General Ghani, the commander of the Quds Force, and others, and representatives, high representatives from Iran's partners in the axis of resistance, from the Houthis to Hezbollah to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So that was a clear message that we are the ones in charge of the region and the support for the axis of resistance, and that's not going to change. And we have seen at the same time kind of increased attacks by Iraqi militias, for example, against the port of Eilat and other Israeli ports. So that's part of the same messaging. And as I said, so it means that on the ground, it's not going to change much. But, Amir Abdullahian's character was basically, as it's also, as he has been also praised in Iran as the diplomat of resistance, or the kind of representative of what they call resistance diplomacy, was important in basically gathering support diplomatically and internationally for the axis of resistance, and effectively acting as their spokesperson because at the end of the day, putting Syria aside because it is still in the crisis, Iran is the only state actor in the axis of resistance. So the foreign minister of the country effectively acted as the spokesperson of the axis. So that's going to be impacted as a result. And also when it comes to what Iran would expect, at least, or hope to benefit from as the kind of post-war arrangements, or basically being included in the talks, that is also going to be impacted by the lack of someone specifically in charge of that. So in that sense, I would even say that the absence of Amir Abdullahian is more consequential for Iranian foreign policy than the absence of the president, ironically. But it is the state of affairs when it comes to Iran's regional policy, of course.
Thank you so much. I want to follow up on this with Dr. Esfandiary. Do you agree with this analysis? And what is the likely outcome of the relationship between Iran and different groups that make up the axis of resistance?
Yes, I fully agree with everything Hamidreza said. The way that Iran looks at these groups, I think it's really critical to understand how Iran views this relationship and this network that it has. From Tehran's perspective, this is the single biggest achievement of the Islamic Republic. It is part of what it calls its forward defense policy, which basically means it's part of ensuring that any crises that happen don't happen inside Iran or on Iran's borders. And so it uses these proxies. It had to build relationships with proxies, remember, because no state, and again, let's put aside Syria for a second, no state really wanted to build relations with the Islamic Republic. So it had to innovate in the way that it conducted foreign policy. And the way that it decided to do that was really to build relationships with non-state actors, in some cases, non-state actors that became state actors. So imagine it from a perspective of success, how much of a success that is. And it had to build these relationships that are very malleable, that are flexible, that are in some cases a little bit more hidden, in some cases very close-knit, in some cases more loose-knit. It really shows the flexibility of Iranian ability to conduct foreign policy and build relationships, and just how good it is at reacting, which is part of what Dr. Kamrava was just saying, how good it is at reacting to crises, managing crises.
That's
exactly.
Right.
That's something that it had to do from the outset. And from Tehran's perspective, in terms of regional policy, at least, it's really succeeded. It's built these relationships. Now, there is just one caveat, is that in some instances, I think Iran overshot in terms of the visibility of its presence. And this is more of a new phenomenon. At the beginning, Iran's ties to these groups were a little bit more hidden. Iran acted through the groups, but without really showing and demonstrating that it was there or that it was the big player in that relationship. And increasingly over the last couple of years, it's become much more visible in countries in the region.
And why is that? How do you explain that?
You know, it's hard to explain. I think part of it is a way for it to demonstrate that it's been successful. Part of it was in reaction, although some of it occurred before the killing of General Soleimani, but part of it was in reaction to that killing. There's just been multiple factors. And then I think there was also a big diversion inside Iran, disagreements inside Iran about how visible its presence should be. Some in the Revolutionary Guards were willing to be much more open about it, whereas others within the previous administration really wanted to keep those ties more hidden, more on the down low, and were calling for things like just, you know, images of pictures with the IRGC's leadership in the region, not to be as public, not to be as open. Nevertheless, that was the course that they chose. And in some instances, I think that hasn't worked out in Iran's favor. We saw that in 2019, particularly in Lebanon and in Iraq, with the discontent that was very much targeted towards Iran. So this is increasingly going to become something that Iran is going to have to manage a little bit more carefully. And they have to be a little bit more acutely aware of this dynamic.
Thank you. Dr. Kamrava, I want to discuss with you some key figures in national politics right now, especially Ali Bagheri Khan. He has been appointed interim foreign minister. We know that he has been heavily involved in Iran's nuclear program negotiations over the years. What can you tell us about his political background?
That's an excellent question, and I wish I had a very clear answer. Bagheri Kani is renowned to be a hardline conservative, very devout, very religious, very conservative. He was he ran the presidential election or the campaign of Saeed Jalili, who is one of the names who's been mentioned. Jalili was a former chief nuclear negotiator and slightly to the right of Attila Dahan, kind of. So he is Bagheri Kani is. He was deputy foreign minister, and there was some chatter that he was giving Amir Abdullahian a hard time because he found Amir Abdullahian too moderate and too pragmatic. But you know, interestingly, as Dr. Esfandiary mentioned earlier, he's been one of the names one of the key figures behind the discussion with the United States. So although he has been an arch conservative, and he has been one of these figures who kind of is also said to be extremely close to Khamenei, ultimately, when it comes to moments of crisis, what we've seen is that this system acts in a very pragmatic way. Expedience, which is one of the core principles of the political system, takes over. In Arabic and Farsi, maslahat. And so, we might still be surprised by a foreign minister who's been renowned to be an arch conservative, but might, in moments of crisis or called upon, he might act in less doctrinaire and less ideological and more pragmatic ways.
Can I just jump in to add something?
Sure.
Again, completely agree with everything that's just been said. What's also important is that Bagheri Kani was part of the nuclear negotiations in the first round with the Western powers. So he's a renowned diplomat. He's a technocrat. He's very good at his job. He created apparently a lot of frustrations for those that were negotiating with him because of his hardline position, because he really was looking to defend Iranian red lines, which ultimately were a little bit more malleable than everybody thought. But so he's a very effective diplomat. And the fact that he's an effective diplomat, but very conservative, actually makes him, I think, quite a dangerous character, because he is likely to really defend the Islamic Republic's positions and ideology, but defend it effectively, unlike some of the other Iranian diplomats that we have seen.
Thank you. Dr. Azizi, let's also talk a little bit on another major figure, Ali Shamkhani, the long-standing head of the Supreme National Security Council, who retired last year. Ali Shamkhani is back. So what do you make of this move, of his decision to return to politics, if we ever retire from politics?
Yeah, this final part actually is the most important. I really don't think there's such a thing as retirement in Iranian politics, So you may be a little bit more distant, a little bit closer, but at the end of the day, once you are part of the system, you are part of the system. And we also saw the destiny of those who decided not to be part of the system, like Amir Hossein Mousavi, like Mustafa Tajzadeh, like Mehdi Karoubi. So anyway, about Shamkhani, actually, that's good you mentioned, because I also wanted to add this, as it was mentioned by Dr. Esfandiary. So yesterday's reports actually were quite interesting, especially the way that they were basically speculated that Shamkhani was handed over, basically, the management of the nuclear file. As far as I could, check, understand, that's not exactly the truth, So it was actually denied by some sources closer to the Raisi administration later. But what it seems to be the actual case is that he was called to be part of a council to give basically consultations, advices on how to handle the nuclear issue. And it was like, so he was one part of that council, one member of that council. It's not like, for example, not like the job that he did in negotiating the deal with Saudi Arabia and facilitating that. So that is quite different. And based on what I can also hear, that might be part of his kind of, let's say, a pre-campaign to run for presidency, to basically say that, yeah, he has been important during all this time, and he's going to now even assume a more important role. So it might really have to do with Shamkhani trying to prepare the ground for running for presidency. But one thing I also would like to mention is the changes we have seen in the handling of different foreign policy issues in Iran over the past few years. And actually, I have written a paper on that. It's going to be published soon, hopefully, with the Middle East Council. One of the things is this kind of informal procedure. So this was quite new, appointing some special representatives of the supreme leader to handle specific files, like Larijani in the case of China, like Shamkhani himself in the case of Saudi Arabia. So it wouldn't come as a surprise if Shamkhani had actually been assigned a more prominent role, but it simply doesn't seem to be the case as it is reported.
Thank you. I want to go back to the issue of regional politics and the role of Sultanate of Oman with you, Dr. Esfandiary. Ali Bakari Khani has been talking to the Americans through the Sultanate of Oman, as you know. What does this back channel mean? And is Oman engaged in mediation or facilitation?
Absolutely. The Omanis have been doing it for a long time. And in fact, if you recall, they were the ones that helped get the initial round of nuclear talks between the Iranians and the Americans going in the lead up to the 2015 nuclear deal. So Omani mediation is something that's very much appreciated both by the Iranians and the Americans. There have been others that have mediated over the years, and actually Qatar has been another one. But I think there's a level of comfort and perhaps a level of bandwidth, which at the moment Doha doesn't have necessarily to deal with Iran, but certainly that the Omanis have, which is why Iran and the US, when there is a need for it, turn to Muscat to do it. Yes, these talks have been going on. I think they're important because they demonstrate that despite the fact that for all intents and purposes, the nuclear deal really is dead, and Iran is continuing to expand its program with no restrictions on it right now. The fact that these talks are occurring demonstrate that still both sides, if conceivable, if possible, if within reach, would like to resolve this issue once and for all. I think on the Iranian side, since the nuclear deal, there really has been a sense of nuclear fatigue. I think they're tired of having to deal with this issue. But at the same time, it's an issue that continues to give them a bargaining chip, which goes back to what we were saying earlier about, elevating that rhetoric about its nuclear program. So it allows them to conduct these talks. There's a willingness to conduct these talks. There's also a sense of urgency because of the US elections this year and the likelihood that the next administration will be a Trump administration, and also that deadline that we have set for October 2024, which is the issue of the snapback, which was something that was inscribed in the nuclear deal. This ability to use this tool to reimpose sanctions on Iran effectively, I think it's October of this year. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that will effectively run out after this October deadline. And so it's kind of this deadline hanging over everything. And the reason why it's problematic is because there's a push on the part of the Western powers to spark the process, to basically bring snapback back in before it runs out, because otherwise effectively you would be acquiescing to the status of Iran's nuclear program right now, which they can't do. So that, I think, combined with the US elections is creating somewhat of a sense of urgency to deal with this matter, which is why the Iranians and the Americans are talking directly. It's just that for once, I'm quite pessimistic that it will actually lead to anything.
Okay. Dr. Kamrava, if I may hit you with two questions. The first one would be, what are some of the likely trends in the post-Khamenei direction of Iranian Shiism? And the second question is, as you know, much has been said about civil-military relations in Iran. How do you describe these relations, and do you think that they are likely to change anytime soon?
Thank you. Those are questions that I think we need another 6.5 hours
You're right.
to do justice to them. But very quickly on Iranian Shiism, thank you for mentioning that, because one of the things we've seen is the steady politicization of Shiism, and or at least state takeover of Shiism in Iran. And recently, Khamenei came out with this notion of political haram, which is kind of a major theological innovation. And you know, I think you need to be a theologian to kind of whether to figure out whether it's ibda or bida. Is it kind of innovation in a positive sense, or is it innovation in a negative sense? But steadily, what we've seen is kind of the reinterpretation of Shiism in Iran, beginning with Khomeini, but certainly picking up under Khamenei for purposes of governing the state. And whether or not this statization of Shiism continues in a post-Khamenei period is something to watch for. I think it's important to remember that for the first decade or so of being the so-called supreme leader, Khamenei kind of took a back seat. He was in the shadow of a much bigger figure, former President Rafsanjani. And it was really beginning in 2009 and the contested presidential election of 2009 when Khamenei became steadily more involved in state affairs and used theological justifications for his various actions. And you know, the latest one, which we've seen, is this whole notion of political haram, which again is kind of, at least in the context of Iranian Shiism, is unheard of. And he has used the notion of political haram in referring to hijab. He has said that not wearing the hijab is both haram insofar as the Sharia is concerned, and it is also a political haram. Again, kind of an innovation. And I think once he departs from the scene, whoever takes over, I think will not necessarily have the same personality. It won't have the same gravitas. It won't have the same network and the same level of prestige among the kind of the inner circle of Iran's state-controlled and state-dominated clerical establishment. And I think that's important. That's an important nuance to keep in mind: state-controlled and state-dominated clerical establishment. So how Iranian Shiism will evolve? The Islamic Republic has forever changed Shiism as a religious, theological, jurisprudential phenomenon, and how that evolution will continue in the post-Khamenei era is, I think, something quite interesting and significant to watch. In terms of civil-military relations, again, you know, I defer here to Dr. Azizi, but I think one of the things we've seen is a steady merging of civil-military relations. And I don't anticipate the Revolutionary Guards becoming any more influential than they already are, largely because they're quite influential already. They run an economic empire. They have been quite influential in not just setting security policy, but also in kind of in the background in shaping the larger foreign policy of the Islamic Republic. And so I think we'll see more of business as usual in terms of civil-military relations, a very close merging of them. You know, one of the phenomena that we have seen is a lot of Revolutionary Guards commanders retire and either go into the parliament run as parliamentary deputies or run one of the state-led enterprises or state-led foundations, or they start private enterprises on their own. And so they use their networks, their connections, and their contacts to exert influence from behind the scenes. And so I don't anticipate any of that changing in the foreseeable future, whether or not Khamenei is around or if he departs from the scene.
Well, I would like to follow up on this with Dr. Azizi. There was a lot of speculation that Raisi would likely succeed Supreme Leader Khamenei. Does that impact the succession of Khamenei or Mujtaba Khamenei can be considered as a likely successor?
I think here also we need to go beyond the specific persons or figures and look at trends.
The factions,
and factions, right? Because I mean, nobody really knows for sure what was or what is going on in the minds of those who are having kind of a say in this whole process. Whether Raisi was their favorite candidate for supreme leadership or not. But the thing is that even if he was in the beginning, I think his track record of, I mean, for example, economic mismanagement and all the problems that was just accumulated further over the past 3 years, that's actually reduced the chances. Holding the position of president, I think, is more important for any faction to have a say in the future, in the post-Khamenei era, than basically putting someone in that position in order to make him supreme leader. Why I'm saying this? Because of course, the trend that we have been witnessing over the past few years has been this kind of conservative dominance over the three branches. And Raisi, for the reasons that I mentioned, his personality, his loyalty, etc., would be best to guarantee that this kind of entrenched IRGC influence that Professor Kamrava mentioned would be very well secured. And in this case, of course, there's a lot of complexities, but one thing we need to also consider is that even within the IRGC, there's not, even that is not as monolithic as it seems from the outside, So these factional politics is quite important. But related to that, I mean, what I could say, if I may, with regard to the civil-military relations, I think at least since 2021, since Raisi is actually coming to power, we haven't had such thing as civil-military relations. It's been clerical military relations. So it's civilian part of the Iranian government being totally sidelined. So that is what's going to basically define the future trajectory of the country after Khamenei. And when we speak about, I fully agree, I totally agree with what Professor Kamrava said. IRGC's influence practically not, being possible to further extend. But for that reason, to preserve that, it is important how this relationship is going to be defined. Because when we speak about clerics, it's not only Khamenei. We have, these ultra hardliners of a Stability Front, they are loyalists of late Ayatollah Mesbahi Yazdi, who was basically a supporter of Islamic government instead of Islamic Republic. So that is not something that I think would be compatible with IRGC's actually economic and political interests in the future. So finding a balance between these two is what is going to define the future trajectory of the country, I think.
And do you think that it's still relevant to talk about reformists today?
I don't think so. I mean, not at the state level, not at the society level, to put it very briefly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. We received a few questions here. One of them is relevant, and I would like to take it to Dr. Esfandiary. Can Iran cooperate with Saudi Arabia in supporting Pakistan today?
Interesting question. I think actually the even more interesting question is to stop just at, can Iran cooperate with Saudi Arabia? That's, I think, a question in itself, right?
That's the question.
Exactly, exactly. So I think everybody was a little taken aback, in a good way, for a change, by the announcement of the Iran-Saudi deal last year. You know, there have been multiple rounds of discussions between the two countries leading up to that deal, but nobody really thought they were going to be able to get over that final threshold in order to get something down on paper. Now, the deal in itself between the two countries kind of establishes not a ceiling, but rather a place to start for the potential expansion of their relationship. And that's the weird kind of sticky situation we find ourselves in today. There is this agreement, which is a good thing. There is now a direct line of communication between Riyadh and Tehran that can be sustained, which is a great thing. It's good for de-escalation. But beyond that, minus taking a few small steps here and there, like, for example, facilitating Hajj for Iranian pilgrims in Saudi Arabia, not much has been done to really expand on the relationship. And the problem is, the expansion of this relationship is one of the raison d'etre of the deal itself. Otherwise, the deal would have been limited to, we finally agreed to reestablish diplomatic relations and talk to each other, and that's it. But one of the things that Tehran wanted was this potential expansion of the relationship, was the expansion of a potential economic relationship, which is really quite key for Tehran. And for Saudi Arabia, the reasons for pursuing this agreement was de-escalation, number one, and number two, perhaps having a certain amount of influence over Iranian activities in the region, which Riyadh perceives as a major threat to it. So if we're now stuck and the relationship can't expand, Iran can't get the perceived benefits of the deal, which are, which it hopes will be an expansion of economic relations. Saudi Arabia can't get its perceived benefits of the deal, which is to help somewhat control Iranian activities in the region and to de-escalate with it. Well, then what is the likelihood that this deal can be sustained? What is the likelihood that this cooperation can be sustained? It's not going to be very high if both sides continue to be deeply disappointed with what the other side is doing. The one factor that I think is different this time around compared to previous rounds of discussions between Iran and Saudi Arabia is the fear factor. I think that's relatively new. The regional context is a lot worse than what it would have been several years ago when the two countries had already reestablished ties. Today, the likelihood of regional escalation is really quite high, as we saw over the last few months. And so there's a very real desire to maintain, at the very least, this channel of communication between the two countries to ensure that things don't get out of hand. But cooperation is another step altogether. I think there is a desire on both sides to expand. I think there is a desire to lead to perhaps more comfortable cooperation with one another, but it's hard to overcome that initial suspicion, dislike of the other side, but it's imperative that they do it.
Okay. Well, it's been already 1 hour of incredible debate, and I wish we had more time for more questions, but we have to conclude. I'm going to conclude with this question to Dr. Kamrava. There has been a crackdown over questions about Raisi's death, hijab, and other critical media reports. So why is this the case?
That's a really good question. As I mentioned earlier, this government does anything and everything possible to alienate ever greater numbers of Iranians. Partly, I think it is to distract attention from, to give people something to worry about so that they don't ask questions, so that they don't have time for kind of a sense to develop a sense of empowerment and potentially to develop oppositional ideas, or I mean there are oppositional ideas, but opportunities rather, kind of have opportunities to protest? That's a really good question. I think the primary reason is just to kind of, the Islamic Republic is a notoriously fractious state. It's not a unitary actor. So there are groups within the state that kind of want to exert themselves. They want to do something. They want to make sure that their agendas are forwarded. I think that's part of it. At the same time, they want to give people something to worry about so they don't ask other questions, or the opportunities for protest or some sort of empowerment don't emerge. And I think this is part of that whole crisis management mode that this state is in right now.
Can I just add to that?
Yes, sure, please.
Very quickly. I
Sure.
completely agree, but also it's I think very simply from their perspective, they have now until the 28th of June, exactly 1 month, to organize an election at a time where voters and voter turnout has been notoriously low. People are a little bit apolitical. They don't believe that they can have any say, really, which is, again, what everybody on this panel was saying with the concentration of power with the hardliners. So I think a lot of it is just down to control and ensuring a measure of smoothness in the next few weeks while they try to deal with this crisis internally. You don't want people to see this as an opportunity to spill out into the streets, to demonstrate discontent, at a time where you have to show unity, at a time where you have to organize elections, and you have to galvanize the population to go out and vote in a month's time, at a time where nobody really believes in voting anymore. So it's a challenging time for them.
It is. Dr. Azizi, any final comment?
No, I just agree with what was said, and the main challenge, I think, in the 1 month that we have until the election is exactly how to, if at all, mobilize people to vote, because even the social support base of the conservatives have been shrinking for economic reasons, for this factionalism. So that is, I mean. Again, Iran is, of course, a land of surprises, but I think if the experience of the past 3-4 years, if we refer to that, then the scope for surprises would be a little bit more limited than what we saw, for example, in the election of Rouhani or somebody like him. So again, what I would anticipate would be something within this conservative spectrum, from the more pragmatic wing to the more hardline wing, so that a safe and smooth transition to post-Khamenei would be still possible.
Well, thank you so much. I would like to extend my personal thanks and the thanks of the Center, the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, for our great panelists, Dr. Mehran Kamrava, Dr. Dina Esfandiary, and Dr. Hamidreza Azizi, for your insight, for your fine analysis, and for your generous time. And I would like also to thank the viewers, who were quite numerous today, following us on this very important topic. Thank you all. All the best.